Good evening, everybody. I'm Daryl Kimball. I'm Executive Director of the Arms Control Association, and I want to welcome everyone this evening to the special meeting for members and friends of the Arms Control Association with Representative Don Beyer to hear more about his efforts to reduce nuclear dangers and to hear more about the work of the newly formed bicameral nuclear weapons and arms control working group. I've asked Mr. Beyer to tell us more about how the working group has been encouraging the Biden administration to engage with Russia on further nuclear arms reduction talks, how the working group's been working together as a group and their four co-chairs with other members of Congress to support decisions by President Biden to reduce the role and number of nuclear weapons as the administration conducts a comprehensive nuclear posture review. So he'll talk about some of those issues, but let me just remind everybody that Congressman Beyer is serving his fourth term as the U.S. representative for beautiful Arlington, Alexandria Falls Church, and parts of Fairfax County across the river from us here in Washington, D.C. He serves as the chairman of the Joint Economic Committee. He's on the House Committee on Ways and Means, and he's on the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, where he chairs the Space Subcommittee. He sometimes has to cast a number of proxy votes for other members of Congress. He was just noting that he's voted for the impeachment of Donald Trump more than the average member of Congress because of some of his proxy voting. But let me also note that he's not just concerned about the existential threats posed by nuclear weapons. He is also the co-chair of the New Democrat Coalition on Climate Change Task Force. He was also the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia from 1990 to 1998 and was ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein under President Obama. And I think it is also accurate to say, Congressman Beyer, that you're a past member of the Arms Control Association. So we're really happy to have you with us. I wanted to note, in case your very good staff didn't mention it, but Congressman Beyer, along with the other working group chairs, Senator Jeff Merkley, Senator Ed Markey, and Congressman John Garamendi, are among the nominees for our annual Arms Control Persons of the Year contest for their efforts with the Nuclear Weapons and Arms Control Working Group. There are 7 other candidates. I don't know how it's going to turn out, Mr. Beyer, but campaigning is allowed. So we'll see how that goes. I encourage all of our members and others to participate in that contest. So after he speaks for a few minutes, we're going to take everybody's questions, and you can do that by moving your cursor down to the Q&A function on the screen, and my colleague Shannon Bugos, our research associate, and I will pitch those questions to Mr. Beyer. So without further ado, Congressman, thanks so much for joining us this evening on what's been a busy week on Capitol Hill. It's such a pleasure to have you and to hear more about your work on the issues that so many of us care about.
Daryl, thank you very much. And thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this discussion tonight with the Arms Control Association. As always, I am appropriately humble when I look at the amazing people that are participating, including my wonderful friend, Ambassador Laura Kennedy, who was leading the Conference on Disarmament those 4 years when I was in Bern and she was in Geneva in Obama 1. And Daryl, I look to you and Shannon and others on your staff for guidance and wisdom again and again. I began paying attention to the nuclear arms race in October 1962 when the nuns at Our Lady of Victory taught us how to hide under our school desks in the event of a nuclear attack. And in my adolescent years, I tried to read everything I could, from John Hershey's Hiroshima to Neville Shute's On the Beach, all the abundant science fiction literature on nuclear apocalypse, especially Walter Miller's A Canticle for Leibowitz. And my entire interest in politics was built on my fear of nuclear war, whether accidental or intentional. In fact, I volunteered for my first campaign in 1982 to do what I could for arms control. I think it was the same year when I took the train to Manhattan for the annual Arms Control Association meeting. I only remember 3 things about that meeting. First, Republican Senator Larry Pressler was there and he was the lead speaker. I just wish I could imagine that today. And second, the historian Barbara Tuckman was there because she'd spoken at my college graduation. And third, I was the only car dealer in attendance. And now I'm flattered and humbled to be part of our Nuclear Weapons and Arms Control Working Group. And thank you for generously nominating us for the ACA award. By the way, when I was in Switzerland for those 4 years, the primary time consumption was the fighting with UBS and Credit Suisse over bank secrecy, bank geheimnis, and the working with the Department of Justice on the 4,500 Americans who'd hid more than $50,000 in Swiss bank accounts. But by far the more important work was trying to close the donut hole of EU or just European sanctions, UN sanctions that Switzerland represented for Iran. Because in 2009, when I went over, Switzerland was where the Iranians were buying and trading their oil. It was where they were doing all their banking, and it was the proxy for a lot of the equipment they were buying, specifically centrifuges. And that was really the number one goal, was to try to get them that closed, working with the P5+1 or the 3+3 to get them to come to the table. It was an enormous amount of work with lots of great U.S. Participants and the help of the Swiss government. By the end, they couldn't do any banking, and we shut down the oil trading there. And they came to the table. And I'm a big fan of JCPOA for many, many reasons, but not the least of which is that as a very small part of helping make it happen. Let me tell you a little about the working group. We started it earlier this year. My phone conversation, I got the idea from Daryl, actually. And when we started it up, John Garamendi said, I'm trying to do the same thing. And of course, Ed Markey and Jeff Merkley have been involved in arms control for decades and decades. So it only made sense that the four of us would get together and push forward. The goals of the working group are pretty simple. Number one, avert a spiraling arms race, minimize the risk of nuclear miscalculation that could lead to a nuclear war. As my friend Walter Pincus has said, no one knows what happens after the first bomb is dropped. I mean, yeah, there was Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it was a very, very unipolar world then. But everything that the nuclear high priests predict and put on paper and war game, it's all imagination. Nobody knows. And finally, to counter nuclear proliferation. So we've been bringing together members and staff from both chambers of Congress to discuss nuclear weapons, to support the arms control efforts, and to explore alternatives to the current nuclear weapons spending plans that we believe are unnecessary and unsafe. We've been very active. We sent a lot of letters to the president, to the national security advisor, to Jake, to other senior administration officials. Jake Sullivan met with us in the White House Situation Room, and we've had a number of other multiple member meetings. It's been really encouraging that the White House and the national security advisor have been paying attention to the letters we send. The current focus of the posture group is shaping the nuclear posture review. And number one, and number two, pushing back against the unnecessary and dangerous nuclear modernization programs, which is not to say all nuclear modernization, just the unnecessary and dangerous parts. To that end, we've been very busy. Over the past few months, we sent a number of letters regarding the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal, the Chinese nuclear expansion, and the nuclear posture review. On AUKUS, we've had several operational questions for the administration and urged them to consider how its implementation is going to impact the United States' ability to strengthen and reinforcement our commitment to non-proliferation. So Australia will be the first non-nuclear country, signing of the NPT, non-proliferation agreement, that's going to have nuclear-powered submarines. So the question is, and under that, in theory, they don't have IAEA examination of the nuclear material. So one of the questions we asked the Biden administration is, how is the IAEA going to enforce the safeguards for nuclear material that is used for naval propulsion in non-nuclear weapon states? And does this let the cat out of the bag, or other non-nuclear states then can be able to go forward and get nuclear-powered submarines. And not accidentally, Iran has said that they want to do exactly that. And then we've seen all the recent news reports on China's expansion of its nuclear arsenal. I think they targeted 1,000 weapons in the next couple of years. I think 300 different silos been observed being from space. And of course, they tested the orbital bombardment system, the hypersonic. So we asked President Biden to directly propose practical steps to reduce nuclear weapons risks with China during a summit with President Xi Jinping. As you know, China has been reluctant or resistant or silent about joining arms control agreements, discussions with the U.S. and with Russia. Among the things we suggested, we're inviting China and other members of the United Nations Security Council to be observers in the U.S. Russia New START Treaty on-site inspections. Just show them how it works, what it's about. Take some of the mystery out of it and hopefully suck them in. The second was to seek agreement with China for advanced notification of ballistic missile launches through the Hague Code of Conduct. Again, trying to get transparency, security. It's a small confidence building measure, but it's real. And a third was to seek an agreement not to target or interfere in nuclear command, control, and communications, the NC3 infrastructure. They wouldn't interfere in ours, we wouldn't interfere in theirs, and a couple of other ideas. And then earlier this year, probably the most important thing we've tried to do is lay out a series of specific policy recommendations to President Biden on how he should reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our nuclear security strategy in the nuclear posture review. Right, the nuclear posture review is whenever the president wants to have one. Trump had one. They're not mandated, I don't think, on a specific timetable. But we think this is an incredibly important opportunity for the president to put his mark on what our nuclear strategy should be. And what we specifically did not want is for the, God bless them, the nuclear high priest in the Pentagon to be doing all this without very strong presidential leadership. So a handful of the things that we strongly urged. Number one was adjusting our declaratory policy to assign a reduced role for U.S. nuclear weapons. And specifically that the U.S. wouldn't need to fire the first shot in a nuclear conflict, and that it configure nuclear forces away from the warfighting posture. I've been a fan of no first use for 40 years. I know Joe Biden has often talked about sole use earlier in his career. Either are a big step forward from where we are right now. A second thing was expanding the evaluation criteria and targeting guidance to include a breakdown of damage expectancy, civilian casualties, and the climactic and humanitarian consequences stemming from nuclear weapons use. Will we have a nuclear winter? What does it do to electromagnetic pulse? Really important things there. A third was examining the number and types of new weapons needed to deter nuclear attack. And that leads obviously to the fourth one, was completing a review of the ground-based strategic deterrent. I know a number of us, I think all four of us on the initial arms control group have been very suspect about the need to replace Minuteman and the enormous cost. And that we should have a real discussion about whether the triad really needs to be a triad now anyway. And then almost finally, eliminating the two new types of nuclear weapons promulgated by President Trump, both of which are likely to exacerbate competition with China and Russia. Just another deadly round of the arms race. This is the W76-2 warhead and the SLCM, the nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. And finally, committing to robust diplomacy with Russia and China on arms control. Recently, we requested an additional meeting with Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, to discuss the nuclear posture review before its release next year. And the reorganization at DoD a few months back had many of us troubled about what the administration's plan on the NPR were going forward. This was the relocation of a senior arms control expert from the House Armed Services Committee, who we had hoped would be that voice of reason at the Pentagon. And so they moved her to the White House. We don't want to believe that it was a malicious act, forcing out somebody that didn't agree with them, but that's certainly the way it looked. And all of this that's going on is with the backdrop of the upcoming Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. That's in January. And I'm sure we will have much more to say about that. That's a quick overview. There are pages and pages and pages of stuff that we've been trying to get done, but thanks for inviting me to tonight, and thanks for all the work that you do. Thanks for being part of the Arms Control Association, contributing your dues and more. Your work is one of the last bulwarks that protecting us from nuclear war, and that's getting us close to a world without the existential threat of nuclear weapons. Presidents and leaders from many different countries and all through the years have said we must get to a world without nuclear weapons. And you're one of the very few organized entities that's trying to make that happen. So Daryl, with that opening, I will yield back to you, and I'm glad that you and Shannon are there to answer the hard questions.
Well, that was a very substantive overview of the issues that you and the working group have been getting into. And I just have to say that, you know, having worked in this field now for many years and been at ACA for 20 years, it sometimes can be demoralizing when we don't hear our elected representatives speaking up about these issues. But the work that you and the others in this working group, and it's now 30 plus members who've been participating in some way or another. I mean, it really is, it's heartening. It's great to see the members and their staff diving into these issues in substantive ways. And that's just so important. So I really thank you for providing leadership on this. And it's also great to hear how you've been dedicated to this issue since you were a wee little tot back in the 1960s. So thank you very much. Let me get to some of the questions that are coming in here, and a couple relate to some of the letters that you sent, and maybe some of these can be simple to answer, but there's one question from Tracy Wilson on whether you all have gotten any sort of response yet on that letter that was sent about AUKUS, the Australia highly enriched uranium propulsion sub deal. That was the most recent one, right?
It was, I think, November 4th, but we have actually the most recent one I think was on China on November 30th. But the AUKUS one we have not received word yet, and that's part of why we hope to meet with Jake Sullivan again soon, just to go through the NPR and China and AUKUS and see where we are. The real concern, aside from the French who are upset. We really have concerned about what windows are open with their. Also, I know there's a pivot to China and to be defensive, but you hate the thought of doing things that aggravate the tension rather than calm it down.
Indeed. And also on AUKUS, Dr. Frank van Hippel from Princeton University, who just recently wrote in Arms Control Today about this issue, just pointed out that there are a number of other members of Congress, including Ed Markey, who's a working group member, Bill Foster, who's a physicist, have been encouraging the United States to switch from HEU fuel to LEU fuel, which is one of the other arguments against the U.S. supplying the Australians with highly enriched uranium fuel.
And the nice part there is Bill Foster, obviously a PhD physicist who worked with Fermi Labs for years, is incredibly knowledgeable on these subjects. So he's not an amateur like me. He's a guy who make a very meaningful suggestion on that.
So there are a couple of questions about the nuclear posture review, and I know you mentioned that the four co-chairs met with National Security Advisor Sullivan back in July. I think it was late in July, and hoping to meet with him again. Without revealing confidences, I mean, how did the conversation go? Was it a simple exchange of pleasantries, or did you all get into it? I mean, what are your expectations at this point about the process, and how how involved the president might be, or is it difficult to tell at this stage?
Yes, it's difficult to tell, but I thought it was a very good conversation. There were no decisions made, so there's nothing for me to not reveal. But we went through the many points that we'd made in the letter. But by the way, the letter, drafted by our team, Grace Rubinger is on our staff, is just amazingly good on this. And Jeff Merkley, of course, worked in arms control as a younger man. We quoted Joe Biden about 70 times. we went through all of his and all in ways that supported our point of view, and in a helpful way. And we walked Jake through the letter, which he'd read ahead of time. But there was no pushback. There was none of no, we absolutely have to do this. This is part of American security. We have to be manly, like Josh Hawley says. None of that stuff. So, but he also didn't commit to how the NPR was going to turn out. But it was clear that he was listening and that he heard us. But between General Austin, Jake, and Tony Blinken, I mean, those are in theory, the three people who have the greatest input and influence on the president overviewing this.
I agree. I mean, based upon our experience, and we've had some engagements, our staff with the Nuclear Posture Review Working Group at the Pentagon. I just was invited to speak to them at the Pentagon on November 22nd. It's pretty clear that, the buck does stop with the president on this one, and he's going to have to make the decisions. And my hope is that the review that the documents that are sent up the chain, allow him to choose among a full range of serious options, as you all were recommending. But it will be the president, and so your further efforts to talk to Jake Sullivan, I think, are going to be very important. Let me ask Shannon to talk a little bit about the status of the U.S. Russia dialogue on nuclear arms control, because one thing you neglected to mention, Congressman Beyer, was that I think the first letter the working group put out in May or so, which was ahead of the Putin-Biden summit in Geneva, was about encouraging him to pursue negotiations with Putin on follow-on agreements to New START. And that's happened. Now, I guess you guys can't claim credit for that because it's, just a common sense idea that Joe Biden was already somewhat supportive of. But Shannon, if you could just update us and on where that stands, and what might be happening next with that. And then Congressman Beyer, just like you to offer your thoughts about what more members of Congress might need to do to push things along. So Shannon, brief update, please.
Certainly. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. So as Daryl mentioned, Presidents Biden and Putin had mentioned restarting the strategic stability dialogue when they had met in June. And so we saw the first meeting of that dialogue in late July. This dialogue has existed for a long time, but the first iteration of it since the Biden administration. And then we saw the second meeting in September. And the September meeting led to the creation of two working groups, one on the future of arms control and one on capabilities and actions with strategic effects. And that second one, all that jargon kind of means that they're looking at different capabilities that from the U.S. or Russian perspective have that strategic effect. So for Russia, that means U.S. missile defenses, for instance. And so there was originally going to be the third round of this dialogue at the end of this year. It got pushed until early 2022. So we'll see when it actually ends up taking place. But it seems like there has been some work happening at that working group level, which Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, who has led the U.S. delegation, has said that they really wanted to see that action within the working groups before they have a next dialogue at her level, along with Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. And so from here, a lot of the conversation is what's happening within those working groups, particularly on the future of arms control, as New START is going to expire in 2026. So ACA has put forward ideas on what we would like to see in a next agreement or agreements. There could be a package of agreements, such as like further reductions in US and Russian strategic nuclear arsenals. But I will hand it over to Representative Beyer to talk a little bit more about the working group's perspective on kind of the future of US Russian arms control based on where we are now.
Thanks, Shannon. The good news is that you and the folks at ACA are paying much more close attention to what's going on in those talks on a regular basis. And what we'd like to do is to be piling on. As Daryl mentioned, we're 30 plus in our working group now and growing. There's no reason why we couldn't be way north of 100 in the next couple of months. And a letter with 100 signatures to the president is more effective than one with 4, even if it's got Ed Markey and Jeff Markley on it. One of my big goals is to try to get at least a Republican on it, or maybe more. Arms control has never been strictly a partisan thing or a Democratic initiative, and we don't want it to be now. Although it's an extraordinarily polarized Congress, as is a polarized country, and sadly, so many things break down to if it's a Democratic thing or a Republican thing, nobody will cross over. But we're going to try, and we're going to try to make it happen. So in general, we're pleased that things are proceeding with Russia. It's tricky. We all paid attention to the conversation the president had with Putin, I guess, yesterday, and the 75,000 troops at the border, and how much of this is posturing and how much of it's real. I mean, there's so many things going on right now, and including what's happening with Nord Stream 2. But I'm hoping that in all the tensions, that what doesn't get lost is the notion that the U.S. and Russia have to keep making progress on arms control, especially with the INF treaties going away, with Open Skies Treaty going away, which, by the way, is something that I hope our working group will turn its attention to. My dear friend, Dr. Pierce Gordon, whom I've also known since I was a little kid, has been really encouraging that we look at re-entering Open Skies, because once again, that transparency provided a lot more confidence for all nations.
Well, on INF, which is an issue that our friend Pierce Gordon has been persistent in reminding me about and you about, and he was the guy who connected the two of us in the conversation about a year, almost 2 years ago. The INF issue is an issue that is on that U.S. Russian strategic security dialogue agenda. The Russians are particularly interested in talking about some sort of stopgap arrangement to avoid a intermediate range missile race. So that is another issue that is out there, and that will likely be part of those discussions. And yeah, I think it would be a great idea, Congressman, to circle back to that early in 2022. Let me go to another question, which we'll try to answer, which had to do with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. As you mentioned, that's coming up soon. It's from January 4th to January 28th in New York. If the Omicron variant doesn't mess things up, there will be actual people meeting there. This is the 10th review conference. Our board chairman, who was on leave, is actually the person who is filling in as the United States lead on that negotiation. I mean, Congressman Beyer, what are your thoughts about, in general, what the U.S. needs to try to accomplish there, and do you all have any plans? It's very 11th hour now about how the working group might weigh in either before, during, or after the NPT review conference.
And Daryl, I don't have a good insight into that. 10 years ago when I was in Switzerland, it was center stage, but I haven't paid close attention to it the last couple of years. We love your input on it. If there's some way that our little working group can contribute to what should be our U.S. objectives there.
All right, very good. That's fair. And let me just tell our members and friends who are on the line that we, the ACA staff, will be there off and on and monitoring this and paying attention, and we will keep you all informed about what we're hearing is happening with that.
Daryl, on the INF and the Russia stuff,
yeah.
I'm really pleased to hear that. The Aspen Institute has you run a series of trips the last number of years that I've been on, mostly with a mixed group, including Russians, and there's usually a long breakdown about all the ways that we feel the Russians have cheated on the INF, and the Russians and how the ways we've cheated on the INF. So and not saying that they're right, but it's really helpful to have that discussion between our lead negotiator to try to get that sorted out, because you're right, getting another intermediate nuclear weapons arms race going would be insane and dangerous.
Indeed. Speaking of Pierce Corden, Pierce is asking in the Q&A a question about the current security situation in Europe, and Eastern Europe in particular, which has been on everybody's minds because of the Ukraine crisis. I mean, this is a general question. Maybe you have some thoughts, maybe you don't. But beyond the particulars of the crisis this month, I mean, how would you like to see the U.S.-Russia dialogue evolve in the coming months? I mean, there are some, as you mentioned, there are some treaties that are no longer in existence. The Open Skies Treaty, INF, the CFE Treaty is essentially dead, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, which existed at least on paper when you were the ambassador in Switzerland. Is this an opening for a kind of a broader ongoing dialogue between the U.S. and Russia on trying to reestablish some sort of more stable understanding about security in Europe as a whole? Or is that too ambitious at this stage to be thinking about?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I don't think it's too ambitious. I think it's essential. I also think that Russia is a very difficult, mystifying thing right now, with so many different balls up in the air. Again, I'm not a Russia expert, except that you look and see their great sense of insecurity with the former Soviet states, with the exception, say, of Belarus, mostly tilting in our direction. The Polands and Czechs and Slovak, et cetera, and especially the Ukraine and Georgia, that, trying to remember that they lost 20 million people during World War II, and that they have a weak economy and a contracting population, and an economy that's almost completely based on extraction. And there's no really reason to look at Russia and think, oh, what a bright future it has. And largely run by the former KGB people that took over all the when my daughter was in the little private school in Switzerland, the American school in Switzerland, they had to have a 10% cap on Russians because there were so many very, very wealthy Russians that wanted to get their children out of Russia and into Switzerland, into private schools, and then keep them there. So I was just trying to understand where Russia is coming from in order to try to calm them down. Obviously it was a lot easier with Medvedev than Putin. And to anything that we can do in the arms control sphere to create ever more agreements is really a wonderful thing.
So we have a few questions about no first use, which you mentioned at the beginning. Maybe you could touch upon some of these. I'm going to try to do this in one fell swoop here. Our friend Alan Ware, who hails from Nuclear Free New Zealand, is pointing out that one of the arguments that some opponents of no first use in the United States are noting is that allies, particularly in Europe, are uncomfortable about a switch in U.S. declaratory policy. We got another question. Where is it? How can we, from Masakatsu Ota from Japan, who's a veteran reporter there in Japan for Kyoto News. How can we persuade allies concerned about China's nuclear buildup that no first use or a policy of sole purpose of nuclear weapons as deterrence is a good idea? So what are your, going back to what you were saying about how you've been a long time supporter of no first use, I mean, how do you look at this from a practical standpoint, as a policymaker, as a human being, what would you say to those who are concerned about a shift to that policy?
That I think strategically and morally and practically, no first use is the only thing that makes sense. The only reason to have nuclear weapons right now is as a deterrent to others who might want to use nuclear weapons. I don't think that there's any place in our humanity for the idea of after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when we often didn't know what we were doing, we just thought it was a bigger bomb, that we could ever use nuclear weapons again. Back to Walter Pincus's comment, we don't know what happens after the first one is dropped. All we know is it would cause unprecedented loss of life. And the trade-off there against any conventional war, Russia invading Crimea or Estonia or Poland or China taking over, the next country. We have Article 5 obligations, obviously, under NATO, but I can't imagine that we would ever fulfill those Article 5 obligations by dropping a nuclear weapon. So the simple answer is yes, it may make some of those countries, say in Estonia or Poland, insecure. On the other hand, I think I'd be pretty insecure if our reaction to a Russian invasion was to drop a nuclear weapon on them. Obviously we probably wouldn't drop it on Tallinn, we'd drop it on something else. But I just think deeply believe that it is only possible reason for us to have nuclear weapons right now is to act as a deterrent, and not necessarily as a deterrent to the use of nuclear weapons, not as a deterrent to a ground-based invasion or cyber attacks or anything else.
Well, and another way to put all that, which is, I think, very eloquent, you mentioned that in the working group's letter to the president on the nuclear posture review, you quoted the president himself back to him. And what you all noted in the letter is that in January of 2017, when President Biden was then vice president and about to go out the door, he said, quote, "Given our non-nuclear capabilities and the nature of today's threats, it's hard to envision a plausible scenario in which the first use of nuclear weapons by the United States would be necessary or make sense," unquote. So that was his soundbite version of this. And, to those asking this question, I think it would be helpful if, those of us with the ability to do so would encourage the leaders in Japan or South Korea or in Eastern Europe who might be concerned about changes to ask themselves the question that President Biden asked in 2017, the question that you're asking, Congressman Beyer, would you think it would make sense in any scenario for the United States to use nuclear weapons first in connection with a conflict that is a conventional conflict?
Let me, by the way, too, I'm sure many of you read Tim Stavridis's and Elliot Ackerman's recent novel about a conflict between the U.S. and China. One of them, I think it was the U.S., the nuclear weapon first. And, it's not too long before, 100 million people are dead. And that just seems to be a risk no leader should ever take.
So let me ask another question here that has more to do with Congress. It's kind of a generational question about Congress. And this is Paul Richards asking this question. He's noting that the Pentagon budget that was just passed by the House exceeds the Biden administration's request. And he's asking whether the younger generation of members of Congress, as he says, under 40, are aware of some of the pitfalls of ballistic missile defense, of the problems with increasing our nuclear warhead production capacity, issues relating to the Test Ban Treaty. I mean, is your sense, as somebody who's been in Congress now for about a dozen years that awareness amongst the newer members of Congress is growing. Is there a deficit? What can be done to help address that issue?
Three quick thoughts. Number one, probably the most significant concern I have is I don't see hardly anybody on the Republican side, maybe a Peter Meyer or an Adam Kinzinger, that isn't reflexively hawkish. I don't think there was a single Republican that voted against the NDAA reauthorization in the last 2 days ago. Going back to the days of who's our Indiana Senator, Dick Lugar and others.
Dick Lugar, yeah.
I don't see any Dick Lugars there at all right now. And again, this is part of the polarization where every Republican is pro-gun and anti-choice. And it's just discouraging. On the Democratic side, my second thought is I am often discouraged by the Democrats who want to go on House Armed Services Committee tend to be people that represent big military bases and or were veterans themselves. Think Elaine Luria. And they, again, with a couple of exceptions, Adam Smith and John Garamendi among them, are sort of reflexively whatever the Pentagon wants, the Pentagon gets. And then my third concern is, I think you're right, that the younger generation, the under 45, the under 40, have been largely raised with the fear of climate change rather than the fear of nuclear weapons. And in fact, even my own political journey, there was a time in the late 90s when the fear of climate change became more immediately existential, if those aren't oxymoronic, than nuclear weapons. That was what we had to, that was the next big thing that we had to do something about right away. And I think most are coming that way. Now, to be fair, I've not had deep conversations with a lot of the newer kids on this stuff. And the ones we've been recruiting, the easier ones have been the folks that we've known for a long time and we know where their politics are.
And Shannon, do you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in because I think we got a good question to segue from here from Jordan Smith. Just on this topic of the education on nuclear issues, he's asking, reducing the monopoly the military-industrial complex has over nuclear weapons knowledge is an integral part of encouraging discussion on reducing nuclear weapons. So they're asking, how can we improve the general public's knowledge of nuclear weapons? I think that's a tough ask considering these issues can get really, really wonky. So over to you, Congressman.
Yeah, and Shannon, I don't have an immediate brief on how we educate the general public. I'm so glad that ACA exists and Council for a Livable World and that the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is still in place. And but it's not something that the American public seems to pay hardly any attention to at all. Maybe when Terminator 5 comes out. But on the other hand, I think we have a real opportunity within the Congress to be educating all the members about the more recent issues. And Grace Rubinger, who's on the call, has been doing our fusion energy reports every month to the Congress, which has nothing to do with arms control, or not much to do with arms control, but a very exciting holy grail for climate change. And there's so much information that people, I can't say they're hungry for it, but they gobble it up when we give it to them. I think we need to be organizing the same kind of information on arms control and getting it out to every member of the House and the Senate.
I wish it.
Grace is probably throwing a bottle at the screen right now, but if not Grace, somebody with approaching her talents.
Well, we should talk about that one because there may be some ways we can collaborate on that. In the old days when I had more hair in my head, I remember in the 1990s there was actually an arms control foreign policy caucus that had funding from the House and a staff, and it was their job to distribute information about these issues, and it helped augment the hardworking staff people like Grace, who today have a lot of a lot of different issues they got to cover. I mean, they're drinking from a fire hose too. So part of the problem is that, you guys are understaffed and overwhelmed with, things to deal with. But
So you probably add underpaid too.
Underpaid, probably all, aren't we all? Well, listen, go ahead.
We have one more question that I think can fall into this group pretty nicely from Martin Fleck from PSR, who's asking, I think based off your remarks earlier, Representative Beyer, about wanting to expand the working group and ideally over 100. So he's asking he's saying that PSR chapters want to encourage more representatives and senators to join the working group. So he's asking about kind of what can some of the grassroots do in order to kind of build that awareness within Congress among the next generation about our issues and how to become more engaged and how to kind of then turn towards the working group as a place to engage on these issues and make progress.
We would love your support, PSR and others. I wonder, I mean, perhaps the next step would be publishing on the ACA website or others, the 40 members that are part of the working group now, as you look and say, hey, Jerry Connolly's not on this working group, or Abigail Spanberg isn't on it. Let's sign them up. But then once again, the best way for anybody to sign up is to get a constituent to ask them. We're all pleasers. There's an automatic yes button in most of our heads. So, and we'd love to have the help recruited.
Well, that'd be a good idea. I mean, Martin Fleck, we should talk about what we can do to work with some of our fellow organizations to encourage their members in home districts and states to ask for that specifically as part of some of the other action alerts that we do. If Tom Countryman were here, this is a theme that he often strikes. He reminds us that members of Congress pay attention to issues when they hear from their constituents, and so all of us need to think about how we can increase the volume. And even though the Arms Control Association is not technically a grassroots membership organization, we have members and we have networks and friends. And that's a big part of the answer to this this challenge of getting Congress more engaged and mobilized and smarter, and getting the public more engaged. So let me just ask if there are more any other questions. It's because we have time for about maybe one more before we're going to let Congressman Beyer have hopefully a quiet evening at home. And then I just want to ask you, Congressman Beyer, if you've got any closing thoughts for all of us this chilly December evening in the nation's capital.
Well, so it seems like one of the final questions, if I may, that people have in the chat that we haven't gotten to yet is the role of our international allies when it comes to nuclear issues. So that's specifically coming up. So to jump back earlier in our conversation about no first use and sole purpose. So there's questions about kind of what can some of the international voices be, such as from NATO allies, and if they are helpful in this conversation about U.S. nuclear declaratory policy and the nuclear posture review.
Yeah, I would think that would be very helpful, especially to the extent that there are people that are worried about no first use. In Estonia, for example. All the more reason to bring in ever more members of Congress. People like Jerry Connolly, who's my next door neighbor and old friend, chairs the U.S. EU Parliament Association with lots and lots of relationships with elected leaders throughout Europe. So, there are many of us who try to build those relationships. I had a long meeting this morning with a number of EU parliamentarians on AI, for example. Those are the same relationships that can be turned to good use when it comes to supporting each other in our arms control objectives.
And Alan Ware reminded us, I think maybe this is the question you're referring to, Shannon, that there's a recent parliamentary letter on no first use that comes from a wide range of parliamentarians from mainly across Europe, but also elsewhere. So we should make sure that you and your team, Congressman, have that. That may be useful, but that's exactly the kind of reinforcement I think the question was asking for. So let me just ask you to offer some closing thoughts. And before you do, I just want to thank you again for joining us tonight for all this time. I want to thank everybody else on this call for their support for the Arms Control Association, your work and your own time on these issues. We can't do our work without your support, and we also depend on people like you, Don, to keep charging ahead. So what are your closing thoughts for us this evening, please?
One thing I hadn't mentioned is, again, with lots of encouragement from Dr. Corden, a long-time fan and encouragement for the need to finally ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. There are a bunch of treaties that need to be ratified, but that's number one on my list. And Daryl, thank you for giving me, for the first time in the 7 years I've been in Congress, an avenue for acting on the nuclear ambitions, or my ambition to make a small contribution to the discussion. So thanks for the idea of creating this working group. And we've already done a bunch of stuff. We need to do much, much more in the years to come. And we'd like to partner with you and the other organizations that are engaged in this in any way we can. And my wife is in Charlottesville tonight at a Virginia Humanities Board meeting. So the dog gets to sleep on the bed tonight. So it's be really fun after this.
A special night. Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's been a great discussion. I hope everybody's enjoyed this. Great questions from everybody. And let me just remind you all that there's an election going on, the Arms Control Person of the Year. So maybe this conversation helped you make some of your choices, but please join in with that, spread the word. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Tony Fleming behind the scenes. Until next time, Congressman Beyer, thanks so much and good night from all of us.
Good night. Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Tony.